Being a police officer, Joe should be one of the most correct characters in Family Guy. However, in reality, that's completely different. And because he's friends with Peter, he always ends up breaking the law and doing completely absurd things. In other words, for a police officer, Joe has a far from exemplary record. And that's why in today's video, we're going to take a look at some of the worst things Joe has done. So make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's get into the video. Let's start with the 5th episode of Season 5, where, after taking a trip, Quagmire simply smuggles several fireworks inside his butt. The crazy thing is, he didn't even need to do this since fireworks weren't illegal. He just did it because he liked the feeling. Okay, but what does this have to do with Joe? Well, it turns out that Quagmire let his friends play with those fireworks, which wasn't a good idea because Peter, the idiot, simply blew off his fingers. So, everyone starts a desperate search to try to find Peter's fingers. However, one of those fingers gets grabbed by a bird, and in trying to catch it, Peter ends up knocking down the bird's nest and breaking its eggs, which makes the bird furious. So, the bird attacks Peter. Then, without thinking twice, Crazy Joe pulls out his gun and shoots the bird. And afterward, to avoid problems, he leaves a knife near the animal to claim that he only shot because the bird was armed and dangerous. Now, if anyone believes the little bird was flying around holding a knife bigger than itself, I don't know about that. Now in the 4th episode of Season 22, Joe was truly a villain because, pretending to be the good guy, he offered a beach house for Peter and Lois to spend their vacation. But this house was in a senior citizens community, a sort of nursing home, where all the old folks were crazy and had a criminal scheme to harvest organs from younger visitors and then sell or implant them into themselves. And Joe knew all about this when he sent Peter and Lois there, because he had made a deal with the old people to take Peter's legs, since, according to the show's logic, if a person gets a leg transplant, a paraplegic can walk again. However, Peter and Lois discover the place's schemes and manage to escape. After all, they were being chased by old people, so escaping wasn't much of a problem. But Joe doesn't let this small setback affect him. After all, he had more friends, so he figures out how to send Cleveland there. And Cleveland really ends up in trouble. Poor guy, he loses his legs, which are implanted into Joe, allowing him to walk again. And there you go, just like in Florida, see? Joe was a real scumbag. He used a friend just to be able to walk again. That's what you call a true villain. Still talking about Joe messing up Cleveland's life, we have the 20th episode of Season 12, where Cleveland returns to Quahog after his show was canceled. But Cleveland's new wife ends up having a huge fight with Lois, and they both forbid their husbands from being friends. However, Peter, not agreeing with this but not wanting to go against his wife, suggests that he and Cleveland start looking for ways to meet up without their wives knowing. And one of the ways Peter finds is by disguising himself as a police officer. And to not draw attention, he just starts beating Cleveland up in the street, because in his mind, that's what police officers do. Then Joe shows up and witnesses the whole scene, so he just joins Peter and starts brutally beating Cleveland because Peter was right. That's really what police officers do. In episode 17 of Season 5, Lois decides to run for mayor of Quahog. And because of that, Peter asks his friends to help with her campaign, promising that if Lois wins, they can do whatever they want, without worrying about the consequences, as if they didn't already do that. But the fact is, the way Joe decided to get votes for Lois was rather questionable, to say the least. Because we see Joe at the police station with a victim of abuse identifying the criminal. And even though the woman is quite shaken, she manages to summon the strength to identify the attacker. But instead of arresting him, Joe turns to the woman and asks her who she's going to vote for, making a blackmail by saying that he would only arrest the criminal if she voted for Lois. And if she refused, he would claim that she had been drinking and was making false accusations. You can't do that, right? Looks like Lois can count on his vote. As you can see, when he wants to, Joe can be quite a jerk. In the 8th episode of Season 15, after writing a really good script, Brian sells it to a TV network and gets his own series. But due to several network interferences, the script ends up being changed and turns into pure garbage. But since he was making a lot of money, Brian doesn't question anything and lets the network do whatever they want. Later, the dog gathers his neighbors to watch the first episode of his show. But this episode was so bad that no one liked it. And apparently the person who hated it the most was Joe, who simply lost it and decided to kill Brian since he was the one responsible for creating that mess. And he only didn't manage to kill the dog because Peter and Quagmire were there and managed to get him out of the house quickly. In episode 14 of season 5, after finding a rare coin, the Griffins managed to sell it for $50,000 and use the money to open a family restaurant. However, their restaurant wasn't attracting enough customers to stay afloat. So, to help them, Joe decides to bring his colleagues to hang out at the place. An idea that Peter absolutely loves because he thinks that having a bunch of police officers frequenting the place will make it popular. But it wasn't one of Joe's police buddies he was talking about. Instead, it was his disabled friends, who quickly fill the place and make the Griffins a fortune. But this doesn't make Peter happy at all because in his mind he wanted his restaurant to be a cool place. And since it was full of disabled people, it turned into a complete joke. So Peter decides to ban all the disabled people from the restaurant, saying that he didn't want that kind of people there. If that's how you want it, but you won't bring us down that easily. But Joe isn't fazed by this. He goes out and brings more disabled people to get back at Peter for being so prejudiced against paraplegics. Okay, but you might be wondering, what can a bunch of paraplegics do against Peter? Well, they just form a megazord of wheelchair users, with John controlling it, of course. And thus, an epic battle begins, ending with the restaurant being completely destroyed and many disabled people injured. In episode 9 of season 4, Lois becomes a thief because she really liked the adrenaline she got from breaking the law. But apparently, she wasn't afraid of getting caught either, since she left everything she stole lying around the house. And on top of that, she invited Joe, who was a police officer, over for dinner. So, realizing that Lois was a thief, Joe decides to arrest her. But the woman wasn't going to give in that easily. So, we get a pretty crazy chase that ends with Joe catching her and beating her up brutally. Shut up, old lady! So, which of these do you think was the worst thing Joe did? Leave it in the comments. I want to know. And if you liked the video, check out this other one on the 10 deleted scenes from Family Guy that will blow your mind. Hurry up and go watch it.